They thought he was brave, a noble boy bleeding from the elbow after a fall in the courtyard, yet smiling, unshaken, not a single tear. The knights whispered of courage, but the physician saw something else. He pressed a finger into the wound, and the boy didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't feel. That was not bravery, that was rot. Underneath the skin of Baldwin, heir to the throne of Jerusalem, something ancient and irreversible had begun. A slow, silent disintegration. He wasn't fearless. He was cursed. He had been born into a kingdom forged by Crusader steel and sealed with holy blood. A Christian outpost in a hostile sea, held together by relics, oaths, and fading victories. His father, Amalric, had ruled like a sword, ruthless and direct. But when Amalric died, the crown passed not to a general, not to a seasoned baron, but to a boy who couldn't feel his own hands. A boy with pale fingers and spots hidden beneath silk gloves. A boy the church refused to call damned, but didn't dare call blessed either. They called it a skin condition, a trial of faith, but in truth they knew Baldwin had leprosy. And leprosy was death in slow motion. Yet he would rule. Baldwin would grow into a king. He would lead armies, ride into war, and face Saladin, the Lion of Islam, on the burning fields of Palestine. But he would do so behind masks and gloves, while his flesh decayed beneath his armor. He would hold court while half the nobles plotted his downfall. He would appoint a child heir while knowing the vultures were already circling. And he would watch his holy kingdom rot faster than his own body. This isn't the story of a mad king or a tyrant. It is the medieval tragedy of a child who bled without pain, ruled without touch, and died without love. But long before the kingdom crumbled, before Saladin broke the gates, before the boy King Baldwin V gasped for breath, there was only silence, a wound that didn't hurt, a hand that couldn't feel, and a crown already heavier than bone. That is where it begins. He was never meant to survive, let alone wear a crown. The moment Baldwin was born, something was wrong. He looked healthy, breathing, blinking, swaddled in the finest silk Jerusalem could offer. But the nurses noticed it first. His hands were too still. He didn't cry when pricked. At first, they thought he was simply calm, one of those blessed royal infants born above pain. But over the years, the truth became harder to ignore. Scratches didn't bleed the way they should. Bruises formed where there had been no blow. When he played with other boys, he never limped, even after falling hard. The court began to whisper, but his mother, Agnes of Courtenay, refused to hear it. She had climbed too far in the brutal game of Crusader politics to have her son declared broken. The first real confirmation came during a lesson. Baldwin scraped his arm against a stone pillar. Skin split open. Blood dripped onto the floor, but he kept reading aloud, indifferent. The tutor went pale. Days later, a physician examined him in secret, pressing a thin needle into the boy's wrist. Baldwin didn't even blink. The verdict was whispered across cold hallways and behind silk curtains: leprosy, but the word was too dangerous to speak aloud. In the 12th century, it didn't just mean disease, it meant damnation. It meant God's judgment, uncleanliness, exile, but exile was impossible. This was no peasant boy. This was the heir to the throne of Jerusalem. Amalric, Baldwin's father, had no choice. He was a Crusader king, crowned in a land soaked with blood and relics, and every noble family wanted a piece of that crown. declaring his son unfit would open the gates to civil war. So Amalric did what kings do, he denied. He silenced the rumor, sealed the diagnosis, and doubled down on his heir. Baldwin would be king. He would be educated, armored, and cloaked in every sacred symbol the church could offer. The boy was fitted with gloves early, fine leather at first, then silk-lined gauntlets to cover the signs. His fingers grew pale, his knuckles stiffened. Still, he was taught to ride, to hold a sword, to keep his back straight even as his body betrayed him. But not all betrayals came from within. The kingdom itself was starting to slip. The walls of Jerusalem held, but the borders did not. Muslim forces gathered under Saladin, who was no longer just a general, but a symbol of unity to the fractured Islamic world. Inside the city, barons schemed and bishops whispered. Baldwin's illness was the perfect excuse, too young, too fragile, too cursed. They waited for him to die, and he knew it. The boy wasn't stupid. He had eyes. He saw how his mother avoided looking at his hands, how the knights wiped their palms after helping him off a horse, how every prayer spoken in his name ended with a pause, as if even God wasn't sure how to bless him. And yet, he did not die. Baldwin turned 13. His father, Amalric, died suddenly, and the barons gathered to choose a new king, only to realize the choice had already been made. The boy no one thought would live now had the crown, and that crown would not rest gently. He was 13 years old and already dying, so they crowned him king. Baldwin stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, swathed in gold and incense, surrounded by men who wanted him gone. His crown was too large, his robes too heavy, and his hands, wrapped in silk, trembled not from fear, but from rot. Outside, the people of Jerusalem whispered about miracles. Inside, the barons whispered about regents. No one expected him to last the year. Some had already picked his replacement. But Baldwin had seen death in his own skin and didn't flinch. He accepted the crown like a boy accepts punishment, silently and without choice. The truth was, Baldwin's kingship began as theater. The real power lay with the barons circling around him. Raymond of Tripoli, a cousin with blood claims and military strength, stepped forward as regent. The church endorsed him. The nobles obeyed him. Baldwin was wheeled out only when public appearances were required, blessed by priests, paraded like a relic. But the boy was watching. He listened to every meeting, memorized names, noticed when letters disappeared or who sat too close to whom. His mind sharpened while his body decayed. And soon, the boy they thought would remain silent began to speak. He shocked them first in council. When asked about a border raid near Beirut, Baldwin interrupted the regent mid-sentence. He proposed a countermarch, outlined logistics, named specific knights for the task. Raymond blinked. The other lords laughed nervously. This was not the puppet they expected. The gloves may have covered deformities, but they did not hide intelligence. And the more Baldwin asserted himself, the more dangerous he became to those who preferred a dead king to a thinking one. But danger worked both ways. As Baldwin tried to take control of his crown, his body continued to collapse. The leprosy advanced into his joints, stiffening fingers, weakening his grip. He began to walk with a slight tilt. His skin flared with lesions that no ointment could hide. His eyes dimmed slightly in one corner, and some claimed his sight was beginning to go. Still, he trained, he rode. He led processions with a straight spine and clenched jaw, hiding pain behind the authority of silence. And yet the wolves circled closer. Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, was a widow now, her young son an heir by blood. Foreign lords sought her hand, knowing marriage meant access to the crown. Raymond grew more ambitious. The patriarch eyed the throne through theological loopholes. Everyone planned for Baldwin's death as if it was scheduled. But Baldwin didn't die, not yet, and worse for them, he began to rule. By his 15th year, the boy king no longer watched from behind curtains. He issued commands, he appointed judges. He spoke not as a child, but as a man whose time was running out, and who had no fear of consequences. Because once you've felt your bones loosen beneath your skin, once you've seen your own blood dry inside gloves, once you've learned the difference between silence and abandonment, you become the one thing a crumbling kingdom fears most. A king who doesn't care if he dies. They tried to keep him behind the walls, but Baldwin would not stay. He had one more thing to prove, that even a dying king could lead an army. He looked like a king, but his body was already breaking from the inside. By the time Baldwin turned 15, his hands had become clawed, his joints stiff with rot, and yet he still rode at the head of royal processions, cloaked in gold and silence. The court called it devotion. The church called it divine suffering, but Baldwin knew what it was: survival. Every morning, he woke to check if he could still grip the reins. Every evening, servants peeled his gloves from his hands like parchment from bone. Yet he never allowed anyone to dress him fully. He insisted on finishing the task himself, even as his fingers curled in unnatural angles. It was the only battle he could fight alone. The mask of the king was crafted carefully, silk gloves to hide the lesions, a crown adjusted to rest gently on his increasingly fragile skull, rich robes to distract from his limp. Even his public speeches were timed, never too long, never too close, so no one would see how quickly he tired. But behind the ritual and reverence, Baldwin was suffocating. He was a ruler who couldn't be touched, a young man whose body had become a sacred horror. The priests praised his endurance, but never dared lay a hand on him. His mother no longer embraced him. When he knelt in prayer, he did so alone, but pain had sharpened his mind. Baldwin began to cut through court lies with terrifying clarity. He identified traitors not by action, but by silence. He sensed ambition in glances, betrayal in pauses. Those who thought him too weak to see were now too afraid to speak. He appointed judges, revoked titles, and began shaping the kingdom not in his image, but in the image of what he knew would come after him. He had no delusions of old age. Everything was temporary, so he made his decisions as a dying man, swiftly, mercilessly, without fear. And then came the test. In 1176, news arrived of Saladin's forces pressing the eastern borders. Most expected Baldwin to delegate. Instead, he summoned armorers. He ordered horses prepared. His generals tried to stop him, but Baldwin refused. He would lead. His armor had to be modified, the gauntlets lined with extra padding to stop them from cutting into exposed sores. When he mounted his horse, his legs shook beneath the weight, but he rode. He rode for days, leading troops through desert heat, while his skin split beneath the metal. The soldiers said they followed a A king with pale skin and hollow eyes who spoke rarely but always clearly. When he raised his sword, it trembled, but it still pointed forward. When they camped, he didn't sleep in tents of silk. He sat upright, praying beside the men, even as his breath grew shallow. His presence inspired them, not because he was strong, but because he was breaking and still moving forward. What they didn't know was that Baldwin was preparing for something greater. He had heard of Saladin's maneuvers near Montgisard. He knew the odds, he knew the risks, but what he wanted wasn't just a victory, it was proof that even a boy with dying hands could command life, that a king wrapped in disease could still bleed for his kingdom. He would get that chance. And the sands of Montgisard would remember it forever. They expected him to run. Instead, he charged. In November of 1177, Saladin invaded with a force that dwarfed the defenders of Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of Muslim troops swept across the plains of the southern coast, aiming to cut the kingdom in half before reinforcements from Europe could arrive. Baldwin had only a fraction of an army, perhaps a few hundred knights, barely 1,000 men total. He was 16. His joints were inflamed, his face was beginning to freeze in a partial grimace, and the disease was now visible through even the thickest gloves. His advisors begged him to stay behind. He ordered his standard raised. The march to Montgisard was madness on paper. Saladin's army was fresh, rested, and well-provisioned. Baldwin's force was cobbled together from what remained in Ascalon, joined by Templars and scattered Crusader detachments. The desert sun blistered the king's skin. He often rode with one eye closed from swelling. His fingers had to be unwrapped and repositioned each morning by squires. Still, he pressed forward, not because he believed in victory, but because the only alternative was submission. Jerusalem would fall if he did nothing. And worse, his reign would be remembered as the moment the Holy Kingdom surrendered without a fight. The battlefield was chosen by need, not strategy. Montgisard was little more than a dry plain near Ramla with no real advantage. But Baldwin had one weapon Saladin didn't: desperation. He ordered a frontal assault, no flanking, no delay. The young king was strapped to his horse, his legs nearly paralyzed, and placed at the center of the charge. He raised his sword with a hand half frozen and aimed it at the center of the Saracen line. And then the unthinkable happened. The Frankish cavalry hit like thunder. Saladin's vanguard, caught off guard and overstretched, collapsed inward. Dust swallowed the desert. Knights crashed through tents and fire pits. Baldwin rode into the center, screaming a prayer, not for glory, but for strength. His horse nearly buckled beneath him, but the line broke. Saladin, fearing encirclement, called a retreat. His massive army, unstoppable just hours before, dissolved into chaos. The boy king didn't see it end. He collapsed from exhaustion and fever before the last enemy fled. His men carried him back, barely conscious, gloves soaked in blood, some his, some not. And when the survivors returned to Jerusalem, they didn't bring back plunder. They brought back a legend. Montgisard became myth, but Baldwin knew the truth. The victory was real. The glory was not. He had gambled his life to buy time, time for the kingdom, time for a future he would not live to see. His body had held together just long enough to matter, but beneath the robes, the flesh was failing faster now. His spine ached, his sight flickered, His bones shifted under pressure like soft stone. And back in the palace, as the crowds chanted his name, the nobility began to whisper again, not about his bravery, but about his replacement. Victory didn't silence his enemies, it fed them. When Baldwin returned from Montgisard, weak and half-conscious, the people hailed him as a savior. But inside the palace, celebration curdled into calculation. The nobles saw the truth beneath the praise. The boy king had risked everything and barely made it back. He had proven he could lead, but also that his body was nearly gone. And so, behind curtains and chalices, the factions sharpened their blades. The court had never been loyal, only patient. From the moment Baldwin was crowned, the nobility split into camps. One side backed Raymond of Tripoli, an experienced general with a blood claim and a dangerous mind. The other rallied around Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, whose late husband had left her with a son, young Baldwin, nephew to the king. But Sibylla was not acting alone. Waiting in the wings was Guy of Lusignan, a Frankish noble with charm, ambition, and a hunger for the crown he could never earn in his own right. He saw Sibylla not as a woman, but as a throne with a pulse. Baldwin saw it all, but he could no longer stop it with force. His joints locked tighter by the week. His right hand began to lose grip entirely. He had days where he could not walk, others where the pain behind his eyes made sunlight unbearable. And yet he ruled. He signed decrees. He dismissed ministers he didn't trust. He tried, in vain, to hold the court together, but it was already rotting from within. No enemy came from the gates now. They came from dining halls and prayer chambers. They wore crosses and kissed rings. The rot was personal. His own mother, Agnes of Courtenay, had returned to court after years in disgrace. She allied herself with the Sibylla faction, using the boy king's failing health as justification to push forward her grandson. Rumors spread like infection, that Baldwin could no longer sire heirs, that he couldn't walk unaided, that he was already senile. The whispers weren't about disease anymore, they were about succession. And in Jerusalem, succession was always a slow-moving war. Baldwin responded the only way he could, by calculating his death. He knew he would not live to see 20, so he began crafting a kingdom that could survive without him. He reviewed lines of succession. He examined alliances. He even considered bypassing his own nephew to install a neutral noble. But every move he made angered someone, and the more he tried to stabilize the realm, the more divided it became. His throne no longer carried authority, it carried weight, and that weight was crushing him faster than the disease ever could. He began to fade from public view. When he did appear, he was gaunt, ghostly, propped upright by attendants who tried not to look directly at him. He was no longer seen as a boy fighting disease. He was a dying king clinging to symbols. Even those who loved him began to prepare for a world without him. And worst of all, so did he. But before he left, he would make one final move, a desperate, fragile gamble, naming a child successor in hopes of buying time Baldwin himself no longer had. He gave the crown to a child because no man left alive could be trusted. Baldwin had run out of time, his body collapsing faster than the kingdom he had tried to preserve. But Jerusalem still stood, and he refused to let it fall into the hands of those who saw the throne as a prize rather than a burden. So he turned to blood. His nephew, Baldwin V, was just a boy, no more than 7. Fragile, quiet, sickly, but he was untainted. A blank slate untouched by the feuds of barons and queens. And in that emptiness, Baldwin IV saw his last hope. He didn't abdicate, he orchestrated. Knowing that death would come within months, Baldwin staged a co-rule. The boy would be crowned now while he was still alive, still able to enforce the choice. He summoned the church. He ordered the nobles. And with trembling hands wrapped in silk and soaked in ointment, he placed a crown on the child's head, not out of pride, but necessity. The act shocked the court. It was not tradition, it was not unanimous, but it was final. Because the dying king still held enough weight in his voice to silence objections, but even children could be weaponized. Within days, the court divided again. Sibylla, the boy's mother, used the crowning to consolidate her influence. Raymond of Tripoli, sensing opportunity, demanded to be named guardian. Baldwin agreed, but only under strict terms. He drafted a regency council made of multiple factions to prevent any single hand from controlling the boy king. And just in case that failed, Baldwin added one more clause. If Baldwin V were to die young, the succession would be decided not in Jerusalem, but by the Pope and the kings of Europe. It was a legal time bomb, meant to keep the throne out of the hands of traitors for at least a little longer. Behind all this maneuvering was not power, but desperation. Baldwin IV had seen too much rot, too much betrayal, too much ambition disguised as loyalty. He knew the moment his body gave out, the wolves would descend. So he filled the hall with laws. He locked the crown behind paper and ritual. He tried to turn succession into a maze, but nothing he wrote could stop what was already coming. Because while the kingdom bowed to his plans in daylight, the factions were already preparing for nightfall. And the boy king, sweet, quiet, sickly Baldwin V, stood at the center of it all like a candle between knives. He didn't rule, he didn't command, he barely spoke. Every word that passed through him came from someone else's mouth. And Baldwin IV, watching from his shaded chamber, understood what he had done. He had passed the crown to an innocent, not because the boy could lead, but because no one else deserved to. He had bought time, weeks, maybe months. But not peace. Baldwin knew the kingdom would not survive long past him, but he had ensured that when it collapsed, the world would see who tore it apart and who tried to hold it together. He would not live to see the end. But he would not leave quietly either. He could no longer walk, no longer see, and yet they still called him king. By 1184, Baldwin IV had become a living monument to suffering. His face was partially paralyzed, his eyes clouded by infection, his limbs locked in unnatural angles. Every movement required assistance. His meals were taken in silence, his breaths shallow and wheezing, and yet the royal seal remained in his possession. He still signed decrees, he still summoned councils, and no one dared remove him because they feared what would follow if they did. He had become a symbol more powerful than a man. His presence, ghastly and silent, held the court in uneasy obedience. No one wanted to be seen as the one who pushed the dying king aside, and Baldwin used that fear like a blade. He ruled from a bed of pain, issuing orders from behind veils and darkened windows, cloaking his condition as best he could. He knew that even a glimpse of what he had become would unravel the fragile illusion of control. So he erased himself from the public eye, transforming into a ghost that still held a crown. But rot doesn't stop at the body, it spreads. The Regency Council he had built around his nephew was already crumbling. Guy of Lusignan moved closer to Sibylla. Whispers turned into pledges, bribes, secret meetings. The Templars, once loyal, began to shift allegiances. Baldwin knew what was happening, but his body no longer allowed him to move fast enough to stop it. He could no longer ride, no longer appear at court. He could barely sit upright for more than an hour. So he wrote, he dictated. He pleaded with the Pope, with allies in Europe, with men who owed him nothing but memory. And memory was all he had left. In private, Baldwin asked that no mirror be left in his chambers. He knew what he had become. When servants removed his gloves, they did so with cloth, avoiding skin. His physicians wept in silence. The king who had once led cavalry through the dust of Montgisard now sat in the dark, flinching at candlelight. And yet, even then, he refused to die, because there was still one more piece to move. In the spring of 1185, Baldwin made a final declaration. He summoned the church, the barons, the scribes. Barely able to speak, he ordered Guy of Lusignan stripped of any right to the crown. It was a bold, desperate strike, a king with one foot in the grave, reaching back to swat the vulture circling above. The room froze. No one expected it. Not because they thought Baldwin was weak, but because they thought he was already gone. But he was not yet. He had lost his vision, his movement, his strength, but not his will. That was the last thing to rot. And even as Jerusalem shifted under the weight of its enemies and its own corruption, Baldwin IV remained anchored at its heart. Alone, blind, dying, but unbroken. Soon his breath would stop. But the kingdom would begin breaking before that. He died quietly, and everything else began to scream. In the spring of 1185, Baldwin IV's body finally surrendered. He was 19. No royal procession marked the moment. No grand declaration echoed through Jerusalem. The boy who had once led armies and outmaneuvered vultures slipped away in the shadows, wrapped in bandages and forgotten prayers. His crown passed not with triumph, but with dread. Because everyone knew the real war hadn't started yet, it had only been waiting for him to stop breathing. The kingdom he left behind was already unraveling. Baldwin V, just 8 years old, was too young to speak in council, too frail to travel without protection, too quiet to fight off the court tearing itself apart around him. The Regency Council Baldwin IV had assembled began splintering within weeks. Raymond of Tripoli claimed authority on paper, but real power started flowing towards Sibylla and her allies. Guy of Lusignan, whom Baldwin had explicitly disinherited, returned to the center of whispers and promises. The boy king was paraded through ceremonies, but he ruled nothing. He was a crown on a stick, moved from room to room by hands that fed him lies. By the summer of 1186, the inevitable happened. Baldwin V died. The cause was never publicly confirmed. Fever, some said. Others hinted poison. The timing was too perfect, the path too convenient. Within days, Sibylla seized the moment. She crowned herself queen, then she crowned her husband, Guy, the one Baldwin IV had tried to keep out. The one he had feared more than Saladin. With one ceremony, Everything Baldwin had built collapsed. The paper protections, the legal traps, the careful balance of barons and church, all undone. The throne was now in the hands of those he had fought to hold back, and the gates of Jerusalem began to shake. Saladin had not disappeared. He had been watching, waiting. He saw the disunity, he saw the gamble, and he moved. In 1187, less than 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin's forces crushed the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. Guy led them, arrogant, unprepared, crowned in defiance of Baldwin's final act. The defeat was total. Jerusalem, the holy city, the prize of the First Crusade, fell not to fire or betrayal, but to inevitability. Baldwin had not died in vain, but he had died too early. He had held the kingdom together with ruined hands, blind eyes, and sheer will. But will alone cannot outlast rot. His reign had been a pause in a storm, a fragile silence before the flood. He gave his life to buy time. But time, like blood, always runs out. And when it did, there was no one left who knew how to stop the bleeding. He was a king who couldn't feel pain, and yet carried more of it than anyone around him. Baldwin IV did not fall in battle. He did not lose his mind. He did not scream. He simply broke, slowly, completely, and alone. Not from sword or fire, but from within. But he wasn't the only one. There was another prince, across the sea, who fought until his body collapsed from illness, the Black Prince. And another king who chose not to rot in silence, but to answer pain with terror, Vlad the Impaler. Different crowns, same ruin. If you want to see what happens when sickness consumes a warrior from the inside, watch The Black Prince. If you want to see what happens when pain turns into vengeance, watch Vlad the Impaler. And if stories like this pull you in, dark, medieval, and real, subscribe. This kingdom of ours is just getting started. There's another fall coming. I'll see you there.